Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Broadcast Club. I am your host this week, Rallina Tricolor.
I am Ange Time.
And I am Nakenashi.
Alright, folks, this month we are discussing gameplay in visual novels, and with us here to discuss that, we have InvertMouse, the developer behind the Unhack series.
Hey guys, what's up? It's Mouse. I've been addicted to game development and storytelling all my life. I started producing games under the name InvertMouse since 2012. The earliest ones, not so good, but I'm working to get better every day. And that includes podcasts as well. Trying to become less shy, and more comfortable with recording. So thanks for having me on, guys. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, of course, really glad to have you. So anyway, before we really dive in too deep here, I think one of the really important things to establish for this topic is what exactly do we mean when we say gameplay in visual novels? There's enough of a blur between what makes a VN and what makes a game as is, but I think it's important to at least sit down and define what are we talking about when we say this, where do we draw the line, at what point does it stop being a VN and start being a game?
Yeah, that's a pretty debatable topic I've seen, not only on the visual novels subreddit, but been different communities I've been in that I've read visual novels. Oh man, just it's such a complex topic because
I mean, I'm not asking you to solve the problem here. I'm just saying, as long as we can get a working definition for this episode, I think that's good enough, right?
Yeah, so if I can, I've actually been kind of grappling with this question for the past week or so because I knew we would have to talk about it here. And kind of the best sort of distinction I could come up with is gameplay in VNs versus something that would be just straight a game, for example, which we'll talk about later. I think gameplay in a VN needs to, for me at least, needs to do something to support the story in some way. Some kind of something more interactive than just clicking the mouse to advance lines that somehow draws the story forward, if that makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, I think at a core level, it's easy to even define. Just making a choice is theoretically gameplay. It's interacting with the medium in a way that actually has you doing things. So I think getting beyond that then is the next step, right? So if there's something there going on that exists beyond just clicking and making choices, that then helps drive that narrative.
If you say making choices is gameplay, maybe you should ask the people on Steam Greenlight first, see what they have to say.
Oh boy, those guys, yeah. Well, fortunately, they won't be talking too much longer, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Steam Direct is coming.
Yeah, one of these days.
But yeah, getting back a little bit on topic, because I think it's kind of like a spectrum, right? We've got on the one end of things, you have stuff where the gameplay is actually very minor. Like, for example, I would say is kind of a game, right? You've got it's an adventure game at its core, but that really means clicking on objects in the world. On the far end of stuff, you have the games or the VNs where the gameplay is a major component, something like Danganronpa, and then you start, at least in my mind, sort of pushing out of the VN genre. I know there's been some drama with things like Long Live the Queen or Zero Time Dilemma not being allowed onto VNDB, for example, and then at the super far end, you've got things like Persona, where half the game is kind of a VN, but it's very clearly not the focus.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of what I was thinking of when I was thinking about stuff with about gameplay and VNs. Is that the gameplay isn't the focus; it's just a supporting factor. Where I mean, I'll be honest, I have not touched the Persona series ever, but my understanding is yes, it's quite story heavy with things, but the gameplay is really a major factor of it, which kind of pushes it into the game sphere instead of the VN sphere.
Yeah, half the game is dungeon crawling with RPG battling. I mean, there's a good amount of story through text where the interface is actually kind of similar to a visual novel, but I mean, a lot of the game is like these difficult dungeons and battles, and then there's a little dating sim-ish aspect to it, which is all making choices and either romancing people of the opposite gender or like making connections with random strangers. But for the most part, yeah, like a vast majority of the choices in that game is through gameplay, and like that visual novel / dating sim stuff is actually pretty optional. Like you don't have to do it. And that's where Nakenashi says like the focus is like, while it's a really nice focus, like a lot of people enjoy, like it's definitely not a mandatory part to beat the game, as opposed to like a visual novel where you obviously have to advance through the text and go through routes to beat the game. But yeah, the focus in Persona, for example, is just to go through the dungeons and watch the story and do all that fun stuff.
Mm-hmm. So the story supports the gameplay in Persona, whereas in a VN, the gameplay supports the story.
That's basically how it goes and stuff like that. Yeah.
Cool.
Another example where it's kind of like a game where the story is kind of supports the gameplay, which is the Blazblue series, which is branded as a fighting game. Like when people say, "Oh, I like Blazblue," like they think, "Well, Blazblue's a cool fighting game." But there's a story mode that is pretty, like the way you advance through text and the interface and everything is pretty visual novel like. And like in the first two games, there's routes, I guess you could say, where you just choose which character you go through the story with, and you see different perspectives, but it's ultimately the same story. You still advance through text and stuff, and you see endings. And then in the later games, the story is more linear, but there's still like a good amount of like fighting game fights within the story, so that's still a big focus. And then the game, when people like talk about the game, they usually talk about the gameplay itself. The story is still pretty talked about and such, but I'd say in that case, Blazblue is definitely more of a game as opposed to a visual novel.
Jumping on, since you're talking about fighting games, did any of you guys? Am I the only one here who's played Melty Blood?
Oh, I was just going to bring that up because Blazblue and Melty Blood are actually both on VNDB, listed as VNs.
Uh-huh. Yeah, because Melty Blood was kind of cool because it's totally a fighting game. Like, especially now, past the first one. The first one had this visual novel story mode, and each sequential one has just kind of gotten more like, no, we're going to play the fighting game here. We're not too worried about the story as much. It's in there some, but it's really very minor compared to the first one. The first one was really like long visual novel segments. You could be reading text for 20, 30 minutes before some of these fights. But what was kind of cool about that was, yeah, you have that, then you have your set roster you can choose for the story, like who you're going to play as. And some of the fights, you would branch one way or the other based on whether you won or lost, which was cool because that's kind of that's kind of where my thought with like the gameplay. Yeah, it's totally its own thing, especially now. But in the original one, that gameplay was actually the way you chose which way you would go. And if you were bad at the game, it was really hard to get the best ending. I know, because I took a long time doing it, because I'm not good at fighting games.
Yeah, but then I guess it means if you want to go down a particular route, you have to lose fights on purpose?
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
That's interesting.
I used a guide for this too. Basically, the idea is that you would win or lose certain fights in certain orders, and so you would just... Oh, maybe if you're bad, you don't intentionally lose them, but you basically, if you're not terrible, you would just tank certain fights and intentionally lose, and then you go down different paths.
Yeah, one of the hardest fights actually in the game for me was down the path where you had to lose the first like 3 fights, I think. The boss at the end of it was one of the worst ones, or maybe I'm misremembering how the routing works. It's been a while. It was one of the worst bosses in the game for me until I figured out how to cheese it.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess it's pretty alright, because then in that case, if there's a friend watching you play and then you suck at the game, then you can just go, hey, I'm just going down the particular route, man. You can just use that as an excuse. It's a good way it's a good excuse.
This is all intentional.
So how's the story in that game? Because it sounds pretty interesting. I might give it a shot.
In Melty Blood?
Yeah, how's the story?
In the original, it's actually a pretty decent story. I think it kind of does require you having played, having gone through Tsukihime, because it uses all the characters from that.
It's a direct sequel.
The things. Yeah, it is. It is a direct sequel. And the game itself is actually, I mean, I did enjoy playing the game, even though some of the fights I was not happy with because I was bad at them. But it was actually pretty good. I enjoyed it quite a bit. So I would, as long as you're somebody who can handle fighting games, I'd recommend it.
Cool, awesome. Might actually give Blazblue a shot as well sometime.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the Blazblues, the story gets really, really confusing, like, even from the beginning, but, I mean, if you're willing to, like, not mind some complex stuff, you don't, and there's some pretty interesting character development and cool stuff that happens.
Yeah, that's cool. It must be a pretty big hurdle for them to overcome because, yeah, as we know, fighting games, traditionally, they have a pretty bad rep in terms of story.
Yeah, generally it's about the focus.
Yeah. Exactly. Listen, I'm not picking up a fighting game for the story most of the time. I'm picking up for the actual competitive nature.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That was, going back to Melty Blood, that was one of the things that was kind of nice about it. It's the only fighting game I've played where, I mean, you had to have the pre-existing knowledge of who all these characters were, and they assumed you knew some things already, but I didn't have to go and look at outside material to get context for anything past that initial premise that you were already expected to know. I didn't have to be like, oh, well, here's this thing, and there was no other game that ever gave us this. It has only ever been in supplemental material, which Tsukihime is not really supplemental material for Melty Blood. It's the game that came before it.
Yeah.
So that was kind of nice. All the other fighting games I've ever played are just like, oh, nope, here's the fighting game. There's a story here, but
Which is really funny, actually, because the Persona series did the same thing. Persona 4 got 2 fighting game spin-offs that have a visual novel story mode, and then there's fighting. But you're expected to lose or win all the battles. You're not supposed to lose all the battles. You're supposed to win all the fights. There's no like branching route system other than you just like picking stuff. They really don't like explore the VN mechanic. They just kind of have it as a framing device for the fights.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it must be pretty difficult because if you want to take game design to the extreme, then ideally every second of gameplay should be engaging. And if you're losing a fight on purpose to go down a particular path, then of course when you're just sitting there and watching that health bar dwindle, then it's not very interesting. Yeah. So
as neat as it is from a story mechanic.
Yeah, I wouldn't know how you can balance that though, unless there's like a suicide button you can hit.
No, there wasn't.
So you just skip right past it.
You just have to sit there and eat shit.
Well, another thing that might make it interesting is some other condition rather than just losing. For instance, perhaps you have to lose, but maybe you have to get the enemy down to 40% health, that sort of thing. That would keep it interesting.
Yeah, or have additional objectives that aren't just the fight itself. But again, I mean, that's the kind of thing where you run a pure fighting game, and it's, I mean, Melty Blood is fairly old, so it's not like there's, you know, a ton of crazy interesting stuff going on there. So it's kind of an old game. I know there's a big community behind it, but it does feel a little bit dated when you're actually playing.
Well, the original one feels really dated. The newer ones are quite complex. The latest one is a pretty decent fighting game. I understand, not that I'm an expert that can speak on them, but I understand it's actually a fairly sophisticated fighter.
Right, but I'm guessing it's not going to be a game you see on Evo or anything like that.
Oh no.
Yeah, but maybe it's just from reputation, so perhaps it is actually quite deep.
I'm drawing a blank. I have a buddy who's really into fighting games, and I know he was super into Melty Blood for a long time, just because I know it does have a real community behind it.
Mm-hmm. Definitely
but
does.
Yeah, if there's someone who's really into fighting games and that gets their approval, then I guess that's the ultimate proof.
Right. But I think it's interesting in the case where Nack makes a good point that it was originally more VN focused, and then it kind of became more of a game over time. Getting back to the topic a little bit here, I think that's actually a pretty good extent on where we sort of define the far end of what makes a game versus a VN, and where we draw that line. Where do you guys think the beginning of gameplay starts? Like, where do you define the first things that separate it from just making choices? Like, I was mentioning this before the recording started to Nakenashi, for example, but like, what about Kara no Shoujo?
Yeah, that one's kind of interesting thing from that respect, because it is a little more than than just making choices, because you have the crime scene investigation where you get to kind of click around and find things. There's spots where you have to put pieces of evidence together and you have to pick the right one. And that's sort of gameplay like, but I think it's only sort of like it's almost gameplay to me, but it really still comes down to choices in my eyes.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sort of design seems to make it flow more naturally. Gameplay that's almost like a bit more passive in nature, as opposed to there's like a complete scene cut and then we jump into something different.
Yeah, because Danganronpa takes that to the next level, for example, where you have the crime scene investigation, but then they actually add on the trial mechanic where you have to sit down and play mini games to discover the truth, rather than the detective character just kind of figuring it out with a little bit of input from you.
Yeah, it's the same thing with the Ace Attorney series, which Ace Attorney and Danganronpa are like, whether you consider either a game or visual novel, they're both, the ratio gameplay to quote unquote visual novel elements are pretty close in those series. So I've sometimes with games like, well, games or VNs, whatever you call it, I was like those series like those, I have trouble figuring out, like, do I really consider like Kara no Shoujo, Ace Attorney, Danganronpa games or VNs? Because those are like the real, like, right in the true middle ground almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's why we have a lot of people who don't consider the Ace Attorney games VNs, and then there's people who do, because they really are right, kind of straddling that line between the two, instead of like, oh no, this is clearly a visual novel or this is clearly a game. There's that nebulous area there where you get those things like Ace Attorney, and again, I haven't played Danganronpa either, but it seems to be kind of in that same area too.
Long Live the Queen as well, which is a game I'm a big fan of. I think Long Live the Queen is great, but it's no longer on VNDB because, I can see why they took it off, but it is very clearly like a VN. It's just there's, I think, a little bit too much focus on the gameplay mechanics that drive the story rather than the other way around.
Yeah, it's just a little too much of the like you say, it's sort of like, it's obviously not a dating sim because that's not the focus of it, but it has that same kind of format that some of those have, where you have these areas of free time. You choose what you want to do on these times. You get to set up what you're training each day and all that. So it really feels like a game more than a visual novel, because you're constantly putting in this stuff because you have stats, which obviously there's VNs with gameplay that we still consider VNs that have stats.
There's the whole SRPG genre of things like that, exactly. Like Utoro Ramono, Rons. And then you get stuff like, I have not played this, I know you have, like Monster Girl Quest, where there's a very heavy RPG component to it.
Monster Girl Quest, I actually kind of have a beef with about calling it an RPG, because it's like, it is, but it's like pretending to be an RPG.
Okay. So again, I haven't played, so please enlighten me about the glory of Monster Girl Quest, Nack.
And you've played it too, right?
Actually, I have not, because I'm not.
Awesome.
I'm not really into the Monster Girl thing, but that's
okay. Well, yeah, okay. So I guess I get to be the expert here, unless Mouse, you've played it.
No, I haven't played it actually.
Awesome.
Yeah,
cool.
but I've heard a bit about it. Is it like a dungeon crawler kind of game, or?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Because that's kind of what when I think of RPG game sort of thing, like RPG in a visual novel hybrid thing, I think of some kind of dungeon crawling component, somewhere I can go out and do like leveling. Not that that's an amazing gameplay mechanic to have to level your characters to see content or anything, but it's very much on the rails. Every single fight that you do in Monster Girl Quest, there's a set level that you're supposed to be at for it, and each fight is pretty much formulaic. Like, if you know the formula to win the fight, you win the fight. There's not any like interesting like ways to game the system or anything. The system exists in its form, and it expects you to figure out the pattern of inputs that either protect you from the enemy or the boss, or whatever it takes for that. There's no there's no real like, this is the way I am going to play this game. No, this is the way the game wants to be played, and so I have to play it that way. Whereas in something that has a game attached to it, I think that you should be able to make these choices on how you want to play the game. Like, I'll talk about it later. This is the only time I'm going to bring it up here, hopefully. Yumina the Ethereal has a large RPG component to it, and it has dungeon crawling segments, and all of your characters in combat, you really do get to figure out, like, yes, there are optimal ways to fight, but you really get to choose. You get to choose all of your skills that you're going to bring to battle. You get to select all of these things. It's not like you're on the rails, like a rail shooter game or something where you're doing whatever and you have to follow this set path. It's very open as far as the way you play the game. Whereas Monster Girl Quest is really, the gameplay is feels kind of static, and honestly, I wanted it to be gone by the end. I just wanted to experience the rest of the story instead of having to play these fights, which to me started to get kind of useless because I wasn't allowing myself to lose anymore to see the bonus content you get when you lose the fights.
Yeah.
I say in a euphemistic way, so I don't have to say what it is. Everyone knows what it is.
Well, that's fair enough, man. Yeah, there are definitely times when the gameplay can get in the way in these types of games, man. I'm gonna get killed for saying this, but let's say with 999 on the DS quite a few years ago. Now, there's nothing wrong with the escape room segments, but the thing is, I'm kind of dumb and impatient, and the story in that game is so good that whenever those puzzle segments come up, I just go like, I don't want to do this. I just want to keep finding out more about the story.
That's something that's actually one of the reasons that I personally don't play a lot of gameplay VNs, is because if I wanted to play a game, I'd play something that was mostly purely gameplay.
You should play
And
Persona.
if I wanted to read a VN, I would read something that doesn't really have much gameplay, because I tend to want one or the other, not some mixture that I'm not in control of.
As far as Zero say, sorry, you go.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, just writing off what InvertMouse said about Zero Escape. Like, I like Knack. I don't mind like gameplay in like visual novels. Like, as long as it like helps with it engages you in a way that relates to the story. I just feel like it's more about the pacing of the game, of the puzzles in Zero Escape. Like, some of them just take freaking forever. Like, if you don't know what you're doing, it could take like almost an hour. I'm like, okay, I don't want to put this valve in this stupid pipe thing, and then I don't know. I just want to see like people die or something. I want to see drama.
Wow.
Oh boy! Wow.
Sorry
Learning
guys. I'm out, man.
soon.
I gotta go, man. This isn't safe, man. This place isn't safe. I'm out.
Oh god. So, I actually did intend to bring up 999 later in the podcast for another segment here, because I think it's a good thing to talk about, and I read it recently. So I'll save a lot of what I wanted to say for that part. But I think it does raise a good point of the pacing effect. Anyway, I think that actually kind of flows in a little bit to the next thing that we wanted to talk about here today. Was, okay, if we have our line of why we have what is a game and what isn't. The meat of the topic here is, why do we have gameplay in VNs in the first place?
That's a good question sometimes, because sometimes I really wonder why some things actually have gameplay and why they couldn't just have a story. Sometimes it does make sense for the kind of story that the VN is telling for it to have gameplay, and actually, it's kind of getting ahead of ourselves, because another topic we're going to talk about is quality of gameplay, but this is too good of an example to not mention in regards to that. Is Rosegun's Days has a combat minigame anytime that any combat happens in the story. Almost any time. There's a couple exceptions where there's not, but when I first started playing it and I got this tutorial for this combat minigame, I was like, oh great, I don't want to do this. This is going to be annoying. This is going to interrupt the flow of the story, and it's going to be awful, and I'm going to hate it. And I loved it, actually, in the end, because instead of having, you've got all kinds of action VNs that have combat taking place at some point during them. There's only so many times you can write the sounds of weapons clashing or guns firing and what have you. That gets old really fast. But for Rosegun's days, every time a fight came up, yeah, you still got some gunshot sound effects or punching sound effects or whatever, but you had to play this game instead of reading this awful stuff. And it actually really... It's timed. You have to get a certain number of hits in the time frame, or else you lose. You don't actually lose. There's no actual penalty for it, but it really heightens the excitement of all of the fight scenes. I thought it was going to detract from the thing. It actually ended up really boosting up the experience. And so in that one, I think that was the inclusion of the gameplay in that was actually it was there because it could make the experience better. Now, it doesn't really speak to some things that seem to just have token gameplay for some reason. I've seen some of that too. And maybe one of you guys has an example of something like that.
Boy, do I. Do we want to go here again?
Well, I guess
are you gonna?
Little Busters.
Oh.
But it's really going to seem like I hate this VN a lot more than I actually do. But I disagree with so many of the design decisions. Which is actually funny because when I talk to another member of the community, C-Tom, about this, he's always like, yeah, well, the mini games in Little Busters are the best part of the common route. And I'm like, no, that's not how... So Little Busters has a couple of mini games in them. They're all optional, which I liked because I left them off for the most part. There's a baseball mini game that allows you to play baseball because there's baseball in Little Busters, because there's baseball in every key visual novel. If June Maida touches something, you can guarantee there'll be baseball in it.
Yeah.
On top of that, there's a battle minigame, and the battle minigame is pure RNG. You can put like items on your characters and stuff that you can collect and do that kind of thing. But when the fights actually start, it's pure RNG. And then when the fight ends, the loser, or the winner, they change in the battle rankings and they get nicknames based on their position in the battle rankings, which are also random. And I just have to say, if the best defense you can offer of your minigame is that the randomness is occasionally hilarious, then I really don't see the point of it. As much as it may be fun to have silly nicknames for your characters, if that's really what it's adding, I can't see it being anything more than token. Now, that said, I can't delve too much into this, but there is one useful thing the minigames do. I don't feel like their inclusion was necessary to achieve what was going for there in the grand scheme of Little Busters, but I can kind of see a little bit of value in it.
Another example of token minigames that are optional is actually in Symphonic Rain. The context of this is main character is a guy who's a Fortell student. It's like a kind of like a piano, but not. It's like but different. But basically, he has like this little music piece he has to do for a test or something, and what he does is he recruits a female singer, which of course is one of his love interests, and while she sings some kind of song, you play the Fortell in a music minigame. So like if you think of games like DDR or whatever, there's some rhythm games where you press buttons to like match up with like notes that are going across the screen. That's basically what you do in Symphonic Rain. It's kind of cool the first time, like, because you kind of feel like you're the main character, like trying to get into the beat of the song, and there's even difficulty modes if you like want to challenge yourself. But the thing is, each girl only has one song each, maybe two for like one or two of them. So you have to hear there's different points you practice the song, which is like actually like performing it for real. So it can get kind of repetitive because it's kind of, they usually just do the same song. So I think that's a case where it's probably unnecessary, but thankfully it's optional. Like you can just have the game auto play the song for you. So ultimately it's not bad, but if they didn't include it and they just kind of just like had like a little music video where they showed a song, I would have been completely fine.
Okay. But until you got tired of the mini game, it sounds like it was kind of a way to draw the reader into the narrative and make you a little more a part of it.
Yeah,
if that makes sense. And to me, that's the kind of reasons that we get gameplay added in, because it gives you this additional level of investment or involvement in the story, past just like I choose this box. It's no, I'm actually doing this thing as the protagonist, instead of just I'm kind of a passive observer who directs things.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so with gameplay in visual novels, it could, maybe it's not necessarily a test of skills, but yeah, it's a way to get you into the role-playing mood as well. So for example, with Symphonic Rain, which I have played a bit of, and yeah, I do recall having to play the same tracks more than once, then you could argue, well, that's what the character is going through, so you can experience like the same tedium that they're going through. And then for Little Busters, for example, once you go through the gameplay in the common route, then once you get to the actual character arcs and then the story gets serious, then you might be able to think back and go, oh, I had so much fun with these characters before, and now like shit is going down the drain. So it's just more of an emotion sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was gonna say on that comment about Symphonic Rain, repeating the things over and over, and experience the kind of tedium that the characters do. Welcome to being a musician. That's like what I do as a performing musician. It's that kind of endless repetition kind of thing. So it kind of does, like, it gets you into this is what they do, like on a much smaller scale. Oh no, I had to practice that song 4 times in Symphonic Rain.
Yeah, a lot more than 4 times.
Let me tell you how many times I've practiced this song.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
because with that sort of gameplay, maybe it'll help us appreciate what those guys are going through. But it's pretty hard to justify because it's a game at the end of the day, so it still has to be fun.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually pretty curious, Mouse, since we forgot you here. I know that you have made VNs with gameplay in them. What was your goal when you were actually including the gameplay in the VN rather than just writing like a VN without gameplay?
The first game that I made under the InvertMouse name was Unhack 1. And now that it's been 5 years, I can go back and admit that I did it out of a lack of confidence, because I don't really know what the audience out there is like just yet. So I wasn't sure, hey, if you make a game that's purely reading, are you going to alienate a lot of people? And a lot of the times when you have gameplay as well, then it gives you a chance to draw more people in as well. Then there's the whole thing, maybe at first I thought, I don't know if the story is going to be good enough. So a lot of it is from a lack of experience and also an attempt to just get as many players to look at your product as possible.
That makes sense.
I mean, I recently played Unhack 1. I unfortunately didn't get a chance to check out Unhack 2, even though I wanted to before we recorded. But I recently played it, and it definitely, I can see the visual novel aspects of it, but kind of like relating back to what we were just talking about things that kind of are right on the line, I actually kind of put Unhack right on the line there for the VN game thing.
Yeah, because I remember at the start of this episode, we were talking about trying to have a perfect blend between gameplay and storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I actually really liked in Unhack how the gameplay actually did drive the story.
Yeah, the gameplay happens at the same time as the story is moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but then the trouble is, when you're moving along the grid, then you have to stop constantly to listen to the dialogue, which a lot of people commented about, and they're right, in retrospect. So in Unhack 2, I've actually gone to a different structure where the reading is purely reading, and then once in a while you do have those gameplay segments where when it's time to solve a puzzle, there is no dialogue to be had. And it almost feels like a step back, right? Because we're trying to marry the two elements together, but in reality, at least for me, I've tried, I wasn't able to find a solution. Maybe someone out there will be able to, but the reality is very difficult because let's say, ideally, if there's a game that's engaging, then chances are it would be somewhat challenging, right? If it's too easy, then you're just going through the routine. But then, if the game is difficult, it's hard to also focus on dialogue at the same time and and narrative, because you can only focus on so many things at once. For example, now Mass Effect is obviously not a visual novel, right?
Well,
yeah, right. I would assume not. All right.
There's no well there. No. I don't think.
Yeah, right. Well,
would.
Either way, but with Mass Effect, for instance, during the combat, sometimes there is actually some dialogue that the characters are going through, but they're not filler in nature, but they're easy to understand. They're not going to throw some complex narrative at you while you're fighting. So it's more like, oh, I got this, man, like the more generic sort of dialogue. Like, it's a romantic notion, to blend those two elements together, but when you really try and do it, I've tried, I wasn't able to do it. I couldn't find a solution.
I mean, it makes sense. You gotta keep in mind, like, gameplay flow and having people in that zone whenever they're going through a game like that. And I think we mentioned 999 earlier, and I want to talk about that a little bit because I played it in the past week or so here, and I think one of the serious issues that you're going to have with gameplay is differing levels of player skill and flow. In particular, if something like 999 where the gameplay is all room escape puzzles, the very first one was a bit frustrating to me because I really wasn't very good at room escape puzzles. But I'm actually really good at puzzles, and so once I kind of got like I finished the first one, I kind of understood how the puzzles worked in 999. It basically came down to, did I immediately identify everything that was clickable in the room? And then that was, like, there was no step 2. There was only a couple of puzzles that were, like, actually challenging puzzles in one of the areas. And so you ranged from some areas, like I was stuck in a freezer at one point, and I didn't realize this one object was clickable, and so I spent, like, 10 minutes trying to figure out how the hell I do this. To other areas, like I was in the casino, and I walked through the casino like I was Neo in the Matrix, solving every single puzzle without even trying, immediately putting things together because I could just see all the connections. And so you run into that kind of thing where it's hard to balance. I can see what they're trying to do with the puzzles in 999. I like the atmosphere they create, where you kind of have to deal with this tension of being separated and working through these puzzles on a time limit. But the reality is, when it really comes down to it, you're not actually in that situation, and the time limit is artificial and gated by the story. So if you have to spend 2 hours solving this puzzle, that doesn't mean you actually advance 2 hours down the story clock that is ticking down on you. It just means you waste 2 hours solving the puzzle. Now, to be fair, I do like that. I played the Steam version of this, and so I've seen some changes from the DS version. I can't even imagine what it would like playing the original, where they added a flowchart to the Steam version where you can go back and replay scenes and move back to previous branches, which makes the process a lot easier. Some of my friends are telling me, like in the old one, you just had to start at the beginning of the game again and solve every single puzzle. Like, I would rather blow my brains out than solve the same room escape puzzle 4 times. That it's like the answer at a certain point. There were certain puzzles where I'm just like, I already know the answer. I'm not even gonna bother. I had to do one of them twice, and I'm just like, okay, I just walked up and entered the passcode that I already knew to get the item I needed, and then just walked out.
Yeah, that's why in Virtue's Last Reward they updated the system. So when you have to redo the puzzles, you can immediately just put in the password and then skip right through it.
Oh, that's nice. I'm looking forward to that. I have not played it yet because I've been distracted by Persona, but I finished 99. It was great, and so I'm looking forward to getting into VLR here.
Yeah, awesome. For me, when I played 999, it was on the DS, and I had a different experience because the casino bit was the room where I got stuck for a while. And eventually, I actually, from memory, I gave up and I looked up a guide. And it turns out that on one of the tables, there's like a card that's on the table, but it's only, like a few pixels in height, so I just missed it. I'm like, oh, come on, man.
Yeah, I got that glorious upscaled resolution.
Yeah, but maybe it's on me, who knows.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got the advantage, Ryan, of having the full monitor instead of the tiny,
Tiny
DS
DS
screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, and another thing is 999 on Steam is voiced. Is that right?
It is. It's great. They
Oh,
got the.
that's awesome.
It's dual audio too, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Is it?
Thought so? I don't. Sorry.
I listened to it in Japanese because they had a big name voice cast for that.
But yeah, one thing that InvertMouse was talking about, like when he was talking about like when he made games, like I think a big part of like whether you add visual novel elements to games or gameplay to visual novels is kind of a matter of perspective and like balance. Like he was saying like, well, he wasn't sure if like people would actually like the VN, so he kind of added in gameplay, but I think ultimately you have to think about, will adding gameplay actually enhance the experience? Because to me, in my personal opinion, if you're going to add gameplay, it has to, first of all, make sense in the context of the story. Like, for example, like I said with Symphonic Grain, like while I said it's repetitive, it at least makes sense to where like you're playing your foretell, those mini games, or like we were just talking about Zero Escape, you are trying to escape from a room, so, and that's like part of the tension stuff. But on the other hand, if you're going to do that, you have to think about pacing, because as I think as Nakenashi was saying earlier, like if you don't want to spend like way too long like figuring out what to do when you just want to get to the damn story. So I think having a good balance of if you're going to include gameplay in a visual novel, like have gameplay that's immersive enough, but not to the point where it can detract from a lot of people who don't feel comfortable playing like heavy puzzle-based gameplay where like they have to. Ralano was saying, well, he kind of figured out how like the patterns of Zero Escape puzzles, but some people might take a long time. Like for me, like InvertMouse is saying, like there's parts where he got stuck and he had to look up a guy. Like unless you like getting stuck, like if you especially you're really into the story, like you don't want to be in that position too long. So I think balancing out pacing as well as immersion is a good way to good things to keep in mind when putting gameplay to visual novel.
So while we're talking about pacing, I was just reminded about probably the worst offender that I've of gameplay VNs. Like this one is really almost a game, but it's on VNDB, and that's the rule that we follow sometimes that makes it a VN. Have any of you played Fate Extra?
No,
Nope.
I've avoided that.
Yeah, so Fate Extra has these literally in the story dungeon grinding segments, more or less, that you really actually need to do so that you can be strong enough to beat the rock, paper, scissors gameplay of the combat system when you get to the boss at the end of each chapter. And it really drags down the pacing of it so much. Like, yes, it makes sense in the story to have this gameplay. It actually does. But it's just so much, and it feels useless, and it just kind of destroys. At some point, I'm just like, what's even going on anymore? I don't remember. And that's not what you want to encounter when you've got gameplay in a VN. You don't want to be stuck on gameplay so long that you don't even know what's going on in the story anymore. And that happened a couple times in Extra for me. It's just like, I don't even want to be doing this gameplay anymore. Like, and that's for me. Like, I used to be a really heavy gamer, and now I'm almost exclusively a VN reader for my free time. So a lot of times if I want to be playing a game, I'm cool with playing a gameplay VN. But if I don't want to be playing a game, I don't want to have to be doing that to see my story in a VN.
Makes sense.
To counterbalance that, for me, they're two of my favorite series of all time. We were talking about them earlier, but to me, Ace Attorney and Danganronpa Series, I think they have, for gameplay VNs, they have the balance between gameplay and visual novels is really, really good, because to me, it's a great, like, the gameplay in both of them is immersive because like in the Ace Attorney series, you're a lawyer. You have to find like evidence and like defend people in court, and like the way the story plays out, like it feels like you get like emotionally into it, like you actually want to like save your client or whatever. But it's not like, say, Zero Escape, where like you'll have a lot of dialogue and then you just have like an hour or so of gameplay puzzles. Like the way it balances out is like you'll see a bunch of dialogue and then maybe you have to move to a different area, and then you talk to people again, and then you look for evidence, and then you see more talking. So to me, you do enough gameplay to feel like you're immersive in the story, but there's enough dialogue to where like the story advances enough. So like it has like a really good balance, and like the story itself is really good. So and the gameplay itself is really good and can be surprisingly challenging at some points when you have to really think about it. But yeah, I think Ace Attorney and Danganronpa to me are great examples of like how to balance the two. Although in those cases, like it's kind of like up in the air of whether one's a visual novel or a game. But to me, I don't really care as labeling either anymore because I just love them so much. So I think as far as a mix of those two series do it really well.
Yeah, I mean, I like Danganronpa a lot, but I'm not of the opinion that the gameplay is particularly good in the Danganronpa games. I think they do a good job of making the trials interesting, and I think the classic of the actual like the core one of you literally shooting holes in people's arguments with their truth bullets, I think that one's actually pretty good. That one was a game that I felt like actually it felt like the mechanics were interesting and reflecting what was going on in the story. I think the problem with Danganronpa is that they have a few too many mini games, and some of them are good. The Truth Bullet one, the original version of Hangman's Gambit from Danganronpa 1 was fine, and I felt reflected what was going on. Danganronpa 2 really improved a lot of things over Danganronpa 1, but the one area that I felt like it was a step back was minigames.
The goddamn surfboard game, man.
The fucking surfboard minigame, the new version of Hangman's Gambit.
Fun.
There are so many things where they're just like, we need to make this more immersive and more engaging, and they just made like weird mini games that make no sense in context. Tell me how surfing on a hoverboard in some weird pixelated like cyberscape going down branching paths is like reflective of your mental thought process. There are far better ways to do this. And the gameplay ends up being frustrating because one of the problems with Danganronpa I found is that a lot of the time I was struggling with the way they wanted me to answer the puzzles rather than the puzzles themselves. Again, I actually feel like that part of the minigame mechanic was improved in 2, where I usually felt like I was less struggling against the nitpickiness. But I think the overall quality of minigames in 2 is just worse in that they made some changes and it made the minigames frustrating or otherwise just tedious. And so like I said, some of the content is good, some of the gameplay is good. I like the classic, the truth bullet shooting. Danganronpa's 2 sword minigames that people complain about, I thought it was fine and kind of fun. Again, you're cutting up your lies with like some sort of truth sword. Some of the aspects added well to what they're trying to do with Danganronpa, but other parts just ended up making me hate the trial system.
Yeah, but Danganronpa 2 has Chiaki though, so that makes it a good game by default.
True that, bruh.
As I said, Danganronpa 2 is better in almost every way. It's just the minigames, man.
Yeah, but the minigames are mostly in the trials themselves. Like, I mean, they're not really. I mean, they're common-ish, but they don't like take too much over the gameplay to the point where like is. Like,
no, they're clearly story first. It's just that the trials themselves can be kind of long, and so you really have to sit down and be like, okay, I'm gonna play minigames for the next hour, and then you play minigames for the next hour. Alright, so the final topic that I wanted to discuss here today is a little bit broader, but I think tying all this into VN's gameplay, can gameplay be used to actually bridge the gap between visual novels and the more mainstream gaming community, and do you think it's a good way to transition people into non-gameplay VNs?
So this is a thing that I've actually seen talked about a lot in the Dev Talk channel on the VNs Discord. There's not a lot of, but there are several devs in there who think that the best way to build an audience is to put some gameplay in there. Because, like you say, there's a good part of people who just don't want to sit down and only read. They want to play a game. They don't want to pay whatever for just a fancy book on the computer. So that's something that I've seen a lot of them saying, is that, they can reach out and that's how they can get an audience. I don't know if that necessarily does transition into people reading pure visual novels. I think it does some people, but you might grab some people who wouldn't have normally checked out VNs. I don't think you're going to see like mass conversion or anything of gamers into VN readers. So I think it can contribute to the pool of visual novel readers, but I don't think it's going to like massively increase the number or anything.
Yeah, that's right. Especially if it all comes down to the percentage as well. If you want to attract traditional gamers into your titles, then I think you need to show immediately that most of your game is gameplay rather than reading. Otherwise, if it's just mostly reading with some small mini games here and there, I don't think that's going to do it.
I mean, that makes sense.
Well, I think about like what's one of the most, I guess you can call mainstream visual novels, or one of many people's verses, Katawa Shoujo. Like, that's not even a Japanese-made visual novel, and has no gameplay at all. But I don't know if like the stars aligned or it was the premise is really interesting to people. But for whatever reason, Katawa Shoujo was many people's first visual novel, and I guess the appeal was the cute girls who have disabilities. So maybe, it's not necessarily gameplay itself. It's just there has to be something that really sticks out about it and makes people talk about it enough to, or make other people want to try it out to begin with.
Yeah, there has to be something to hook people onto it. I mean, that's true for most things. You have to have some kind of hook for people to be like, oh, I actually want to look at this. And Katawa Shoujo is, I mean, like you say, it doesn't have gameplay, so I don't want to talk about it at length or anything. But it has that weird kind of premise that you're like, oh, this has to be a joke. And then you get into it and you're like, oh, no, this is actually really serious. And wow, I wasn't expecting this at all.
Yeah, I think, honestly, as far as that goes, Katawa Shoujo gets more visibility for being isn't that cripple girl dating sim that 4chan made, than its own necessarily merits as a VN. I'm not saying that's bad. I just mean like the knowledge of it as being a common thing in the gaming community is more from the absurdity of what's going on there. That said, I do think something that's worth noting is that while Katawa Shoujo may be the best known pure visual novel, I think that a lot of VNs that have gameplay elements in them are actually, they have more, some of them do in fact have a larger mainstream appeal. Things like 999 and VLR are reviewed as games, and people praise them for their the story, but it's they're being treated as proper games. Things like Danganronpa, Ace Attorney is a very popular series, right? I think what it comes down to is that there are plenty of people who play these things, but they don't think of them necessarily as visual novels, and they don't ever make that jump to, this is a visual novel, I want more of this. They think, this is a neat game, but I still just play video games. And I think that's really the boundary you have to cross, is that, as Nack mentioned earlier, I think not a lot of people are necessarily going to make that connection. I certainly know that when I was getting into this stuff, I knew what things like Ace Attorney and VLR and were long before I really ever thought about what a VN was, and I thought of them as games, not as visual novels.
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up too, like, because I'm sure for people who consider them visual novels, of course, like some people's first visual novel could be the Ace Attorney or the Danganronpa series, but like Ralana said, they don't think of them as visual novels. Think, oh well, these are just cool puzzle games that just happen to have a lot of text and a really good story, but the term visual novel isn't what they're usually branded as, especially like a reviewer's not going to say, oh, this is a cool visual novel that has cool gameplay. No, this is a game and it just happens to have a really good story and a lot of text. So I guess that's why earlier when Nack was kind of disagreeing with devs that adding gameplay won't necessarily bring in bridge a gap. I think, unfortunately, you kind of just have to get into it through some way. Like the reason I brought Katawa Shoujo earlier was like, there just has to be some kind of other external influence that would get you into visual novel to begin with and learn about it. And I don't think gameplay is a consistent way to do it because, like as we just said, if you add gameplay, a lot of gameplay, people will just consider it a game and not a visual novel, and they won't even know what a visual novel is or that they're even playing/reading a visual novel if they are.
I actually have some numbers right now, by the way. I'm on Steam charts looking at current player counts of various visual novels. So looking at, for example, Grisaya, one of the most popular VNs on VNDB. Current players 24, 30-day average 13. If we look at Steins Gate, current players 26, 30-day average 27. Umineko, getting a little more obscure stuff, current players 3, 30-day average 9.8. Danganronpa, right? Current players 303, 30-day average 202. There's a massive difference in what the gaming community sees, from a game and a VN, right? There's just a huge spike there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to kind of the thing is, like you say, I mean, if you're looking to build an audience by adding gameplay to your VN, I think it's a way to do it, possibly, depending on how you do it. Personally, I don't really like the idea of it because, as a rather kind of selfish thing, like I said earlier, when I sit down to play a VN or read a VN, I want to read a VN, not play a game. So from my perspective, I actually don't like necessarily seeing that all the time. Seeing people be like, oh, well, if I want to be successful, I have to add gameplay. And like, well, that's fine, I guess. I mean, if you want to be maybe if you want to be commercially successful, adding gameplay is the way to do it in the Western market. But for me, who is more interested in just experiencing whatever story people have to tell, I don't necessarily like that. And that's just kind of my selfish perspective.
I mean, I would agree with that too.
Yeah, it's like, obviously, if you're making this and you want to turn profit on it, yeah, that might actually be correct, that you should add some gameplay or not saying it's necessary, but it probably couldn't hurt. But then from my perspective, someone who just wants to be told well thought out, interesting stories without that gameplay getting in the way, it seems kind of not like something I want to hear.
I'd much rather have gameplay that was designed to be there for the story, like something like 999, where the gameplay is an integral part of the entire experience, rather than just sort of tacked on to get sales. But I mean, that's the world we live in, right? Developers gotta make money too, yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah, that's the thing, and that's why I can't like condemn anybody for saying they want to do that. I mean, we've got a developer on right now who has done some VN gameplay hybrids, like we said, and like obviously I don't want to condemn anyone for doing that, but it's just as a fan of the medium, I don't like hearing that sentiment sometimes from devs.
Yeah, and then one last thing to consider would be the budget as well. As soon as you bring gameplay into consideration, suddenly you have to divide your money as well as your time. And that's why very often, if it's not managed properly, you end up with just like half-assed of both.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's absolutely a thing. I mean, if you're adding every extra feature you would add to something detracts time from features you already have. Theoretically, if you in a perfect world, you have an infinite amount of time to create your thing, but that's not how these things work. So obviously, I mean, the more things you add, the less time you can spend on everything, and so it feels like sometimes maybe if you would add gameplay to reach a larger audience, because you're doing that, you might be reaching that audience, but you might be alienating the core VN reader base, which is smaller than the audience of gamers, unfortunately for us. So that's why it makes sense, like from a business perspective, to want to add that in to grab a bigger audience. But again, I've said it like 3 times already. That feels bad to me because that's not what I want. But that's just me being selfish. So stop adding gameplay to your VNs. I just want to read your stories, okay? Okay, devs. That's all, I'm done.
Okay.
Oh man. Well, I think that's actually a pretty good place to wrap up the discussion here. And with that, we'll transition into a little bit of community news. There's not a whole lot that's happened in the past month, but there definitely are a few things you should know about. The first thing, which was very easy to miss, but a couple of days ago, as of this recording, there was a Frontwing AMA on the visual novel subreddit, and somebody asked about the Tsubihime translation project status, and Frontwing explained that it wouldn't be too crazy to look forward to seeing it sometime around this summer. That's really cool. I don't think anyone was expecting to see it quite so soon, so I'm really hoping that actually follows through.
I was totally expecting when they said 2017, December 31st.
At 11:59 p.m.
Surprise! Yeah, but it sounds like maybe that won't be the case.
Next up, it seems that after NaNoWriMo happened, we had a total of 71 submissions. I know, Knack, you were on our tracking duty to keep up with that. How did that go?
Oh, yeah, that was a thing that I was going to do, wasn't it? It was great. I promptly forgot everything about it after, the 6th. The day after we recorded, I checked it out. The day after we recorded the last episode, I checked it out. And I didn't do anything more.
Great, thanks, Knack. Moving right along. News that is close to my heart is that the 5th chapter of Higurashi Meyakashi is available for pre-order and has a release date at the end of April. Highly recommend checking the series out. Meyakashi is also my favorite chapter, so I'm glad that they're still moving along with the answer arcs being translated.
That would be the 5th arc or chapter?
Yes, chapter 5. So the first set of the answer arcs is Meyakashi.
Okay.
After that, we've got Utawara Rumono, also has a release date for May 23rd in the Americas and in Europe on PS4 and Vita.
That's the one I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, I was to say, for a topic about VNs gameplay, somehow it never came up because I don't think any of us have played
the original was pretty old. I have actually played it on the PC a long time ago.
Okay.
It's been on my I should play this list for a long time, and I just never have gotten to it because that list is so massive. Yeah.
There were a couple of minor announcements from Manga Gamer and Sekai Project during NIA Boston. I mean, maybe some interesting things. I think the coolest one is the VR project from Isuna Hasakura, which is he's the author of World End Economica and Spice and Wolf, doing a visual novel mystery in VR. I've seen some kind of mixed things about it on Steam, but again, there's a couple of small VNs there. There were also a ton of Kickstarters the past month. Honestly, a little bit too many to follow at some level. But there's lots of small things here and there. I think with the Phantom Trigger, that was this month, right? That happened. I've kind of stopped following Grisaya stuff.
Maybe there were so many things up there. I don't remember when everything started. Phantom Trigger ended not all that long ago. It was funded day one, I think. So I think a lot of people, if you weren't interested in more Grisaya, you kind of forgot about it, like I did. I think it ended maybe only a week ago as of when we're recording. That happened. Yeah,
and then lastly, on a very small note, there were a bunch of fun April Fool's jokes that came out on April 1st. If you haven't seen those, you should go back and take a look through some things like the entirety of Emoto Paradise 2 being translated via emoticons, or the new Sekai Project visual novel about cows and children. It's just some fun things happen out there. Again, I recommend taking a look. But I think that basically covers it for news this month. So the next thing we're going to have here is our Shill segment. This time it is Nakenashi, so I will let you take it away.
All right, thank you, Alana. So despite what might have seemed like a rather constant barrage of attacks on gameplay and VNs for me so far this episode, I actually do like gameplay VNs when I'm in the mood for them. So I'd like to tell you all about my personal favorite gameplay VN, Yumina the Ethereal. In a nutshell, the premise is the titular heroine, Yumina, just missed an important test that's going to cause her to not only fail one of her classes, but to be held back for the entire year. Luckily for her, the school is about to have an election war. Yes, that's right, I said war. For the next student council president, who, when elected, is able to change one rule about the school. Recruited into the debate club as a candidate by the mysterious Kirara, who is best girl might I add, Yumino runs as their candidate to become the next student council president. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Well, it kind of is. Yumino the Ethereal is definitely first and foremost a comedy, and it truly excels in that department. The debate club play off one another incredibly well, and I found myself falling in love with the cast from a very early stage. Of course, as I mentioned earlier in the cast, Yumino the Ethereal is a gameplay VN, and it's one that I think strikes a near-perfect balance. The election war is actually fought using words, not weapons, but due to a fancy tech called the Ethereal system, these are represented by weapon combat in the gameplay perspective. Still sounds ridiculous? It sure does, but it is damn entertaining. The combat seems intimidating at first, but it's actually rather intuitive, as the game will telegraph for you what the enemy is going to do each round, so you can attempt to use that against them at least. Leveling is important when you're given the opportunity to grind levels, but because the combat isn't terribly difficult, by simply fighting enemies a few levels higher than you, you're able to advance to your target level rather quickly, only truly requiring battle counts in the single digits per chapter. I originally picked up Yumina as a secondary read that I could relax with, but I quickly found myself devoting any scrap of free time I could to it instead of what I was supposed to be reading. Of course, I won't get into it now because of spoilers, but from a very early stage, and as you might have figured out already from how absurd this premise sounds, there's a little more than meets the eye to this situation. But in order to figure out what it is, you'll just have to check out Yumina yourself. You can pick it up at the Just USA website under the 18 Plus section, and I assure you it is worth every penny you'll pay, sale price or no.
Alright, thanks for that recommendation, Knack. Now, just a note going forwards, but now that myself, Ange, and Knack have all finished our little shills, we would like to open this segment up to the community at large. So the goal here is that basically going forward on our episodes, you guys from the community can submit shill segments, come by, record something real quick, but it's a good way for you to say, hey, I really like this VN, I want other people to read this VN, and so you come on here just for 2 minutes or so, tell us why the VN's so great, we'll include it in the episode, and you can spread the word. So if you're interested in that, send us a message either on our website, Twitter, Reddit, really anywhere, but we're open to people having suggestions, so if you've been looking for a way to get the word out, then please let us know. On top of that, something a little bit fun here is that InvertMouse has offered to do a small giveaway. I'll let him explain the details, but to enter, just tweet at VN Broadcast Club about what topics you'd like to see covered. Mouse?
Cool. So I go to conventions from time to time, and very often when I do, I give away postcards for people. I never, you don't have to subscribe to a newsletter or like me on Facebook, anything like that. It's just more about, hey, we had a chance to meet, so I want to leave you with a little something. And it's the same case here. Since you guys took the time to listen to this whole episode, I figured, how about we do a little giveaway?
Yeah, great. So, appreciate that, Mouse. So again, guys, if you're interested in getting a postcard from InvertMouse here with some of his VN artwork on that, go ahead and just, again, tweet at VN Broadcast Club with the topic you'd be interested in seeing us cover, and we'll get you guys entered to have some more information about that on Twitter. Anyway, I think that does wrap things up here for this episode of the Broadcast Club. You can join us next month for talking about translation quality. Thanks everyone for listening, and thanks Mouse for coming along.
Yeah, all good, man. Thanks for having me on.
Alright, and by the way, if you're curious about the music that's playing right now, it is from Mouse's upcoming VN, The Last Birdling. Anyway, I've been Rowlin' a Tricolor.
I've been Nakenashi.
I'm Ange Time, as always.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.